My name is Giambrone, and I'm the City Councillor for Ward 18, the Chair of the Toronto Transit Commission. I guess I want to just start out by saying why I'm against the death penalty here in Canada, and I guess it's for a couple fundamental reasons, both practical as well as I guess personal. First of all, I have to tell you, from everything I've seen across the world and having traveled to countries with the death penalty that are in effect, we know statistically that the death penalty doesn't actually help deter crime. Most crimes are crimes of, perhaps not passion, that's a certain kind of crime, but certainly crimes that are committed because people feel very strongly, or they're not thinking at the time at which they're committing the crime. And so the number of people who actually weigh all the different factors, including the possibility of being put to death for a crime, are very small. And so when you look at it from an overall perspective, it has a very small actual effect on the amount of crime. The United States is a good example, and there are lots of other countries around the world. It also, looking at states that have the death penalty in the United States, by the time you factor in the cost of appeals, because if you were going to have it, and of course we're against it, but if you were going to have it, and to the small credit of the United States, they have a long process in many appeals. There are fundamental problems with race or racial, how people are actually, the number of people of visible minorities who are put to death versus non-visible minorities. But even the United States has a number of very stringent protections, which from a perspective of cost, which is another very cold-hearted way of looking at it, drive up the cost of the death penalty, or places with the death penalty, in fact, create a situation where in fact it's not necessarily cheaper than putting inside. And going above all those other very cold-hearted look at why you'd want to have a death penalty or not from a strictly policy perspective, there's the whole issue of fundamental human rights. And people, unfortunately, crimes are committed. People who commit those crimes are still human, and they don't lose that humanity. They may sacrifice some of their liberty in the terms of a prison sentence, but at the heart of it, they still remain people. And the concept that you would take away life, whether or not you actually know you're taking away the life of the correct person, which remains, of course, a fear for many people around the death penalty, but that fundamental principle about the state sinking to the same level of a criminal and actually putting to death one of its own citizens in punishment is just, for me as a person, unacceptable. For me as a citizen of Canada, is unacceptable. And we have right now a fairly long history. I think the last execution in Canada was in the late 1960s, had effectively been fairly reduced throughout the 60s and late 50s, but the concept that we would be stepping back from that in any regard is concerning. And we have a long history of advocating for it internationally, consistent with many of our international partners in the European Union and in other countries around the world. And it's somewhat disconcerting that our own federal government would be stepping back from that commitment as it pertains to not just Canadians being held abroad. Obviously they are of particular concern to us as Canadians, but we need to speak out for the citizens of the world, whether they be in China, which executes the most number of people anywhere in the world, in the United States, which has problems with who it executes, i.e. the access to justice in the United States is a particular problem, or really in any of the other over 200 member states of the United Nations. And it's unfortunate that our Prime Minister would be making that decision. We need to be as strong as ever, both for the very cold-hearted reasons that I started out by talking about from a policy perspective, or from the very fundamental reasons for us as a human being, why we would not want our country to either be advocating, either specifically or by not speaking out, which can sometimes be as harmful, or in the case of just not having a strong articulated policy perspective. So while I represent a local level, which doesn't necessarily speak out specifically on national or even international issues, I think there's a fairly good consensus in this country that says, no, we don't want to go back to having the death penalty. Yes, from time to time there are horrendous crimes that are committed. Those people obviously owe a debt to society. They have committed a crime for a reason. it doesn't have to be a good reason, but the fact is that we have an obligation as a civilized society to deal with our citizens and people in other countries in a fair, just, and humane manner.